Jacob pressed the binoculars to his face, taking in all the information he could. Through the magnifying lenses, he could see the strange aliens as they raised their arms skyward and began to sing in a strange sound, similar to one of the clarinets from the history videos. He stared at the stoned face as a great force began to erupt from the ground, as if from a simple wish of the bearded creatures. What was more, a river began to flow from a crack in the wasteland, which spread until it had the width of the Earth's Mississippi River. It was almost identical except for the strange purple tint upon the liquid. Jacob lowered the binoculars and began to frown. This is how it always began. These Homo lapido, or the Dryads, as General Asgrenas called them, always seemed to sing to a planet itself in order to grow forests and create rivers. However, the forest had a terrible effect. These plants actually take in oxygen, much like humanity, and release a neurotoxin that is lethal to every known species, and seemed to have no effect on the creatures themselves. After years of similar behavior, humanity was pushed to the brink. The Dryads had done away with humanity world after world, cultivating the land to their whim. They had no weapons, with the exception of the plants they grew, which acted like guardians to the Dryads, which protected them from bullets and other means of human assault. Unlike typical plants, these roots seemed to absorb the bullets and use them as nutrients, growing in size and stature. Today was different, though. It seemed as though the creatures were growing trees into shapes of huts, as though they were architects forming a great city out of a living forest. Jacob looked to his left and saw Rachel holding up her binoculars, scanning the Dryads as they performed their strange motions.
It seems that it's going to be much more difficult to make acquaintances with them,
she whispered, barely audible over the creatures' combined voices. Jacob looked back at the Dryads, squinting to get a better view of the strange purple mist that began to engulf the far-off foliage.
Yes, indeed it does,
he replied, remembering their mission. This was not a simple search-and-destroy mission. His black dragons could easily handle that. This mission was more about diplomacy than decimation. The team had to find some way to communicate with the strange beings. The eggheads in the Sol system believed that what this war is about is simply miscommunication. The brass immediately ordered the black dragons to move behind enemy lines to find a way to offer peace to the Dryads.
At least we can still breathe,
thought Jacob, looking at his wrist. Each of the team members carried an oxygen percentage gauge, or OPG, that showed just how much air was still breathable. Right now it showed 89%. Not as much as he would hope, but it would be enough for what they had to do.
Hey, Commander?
Hissed the radio on his hip.
This is Sam reporting in.
Go ahead,
replied Jacob, wondering what was going on. Sam almost never used his radio unless it was something important. It was several seconds before there was a simple reply.
You may want to come to my position. I could explain over the radio, but it would be easier to show you what's going on.
Jacob reached to his pack and pulled a small tablet out of one of the pockets. He activated the GPS's tracker to show Sam's location. It was almost a mile and a half away. Rachel leaned over his shoulder to get a view of the tablet and frowned.
This had better be important,
she stated, as if reading his thoughts. Half an hour later, Jacob and Rachel arrived at Sam's location. It took several minutes to find him, but eventually he raised his hand to signal where he was. Jacob was not surprised that he was hard to find. In boot camp it took Sergeant Mayford 3 hours to find him hiding in a small pile of leaves, using them as an instant ghillie suit. This time was basically the same, except the difference was the hard red dirt he used to powder his black armor a rusty orange. The sunlight reflecting off it only heightened the camouflage. Sam put one finger over his mouth, signaling the others to be quiet, and then slowly raised his hand to a point just over the hill.
Look,
he whispered, crawling on his stomach to reach the crest of the hill. Rachel and Jacob mirrored him, crawling through the crusty sand until they as well reached the top. Jacob froze, wide eyes staring at an unbelievable sight in front of him. Just over the hill were two of the Dryads, staring eye to eye with each other. Every so often one would speak, a small flute-like sound emanating from its facial structure. Each seemed to reply to the other in a similar manner, until suddenly the conversation was over, and they reached down into the dirt for something.
Wait.
Jacob thought.
Not reaching for something. They're planting something.
Sure enough, the Dryads were placing seedlings into the ground, the sprouts quickly reaching back out of the dirt the second the Dryads' fingers moved. They didn't create forests out of nowhere, but it was like they were simply farmers. They seemed to care about each sprout like a mother loves her children, tenderly stepping as to not crush the delicate seedlings underfoot. After a few feet, the Dryads would repeat this process with the same care as when they started. Jacob watched, absolutely dumbstruck, through the entire process. He assumed his teammates were similarly engaged, and sure enough, when he looked to his right, he saw an awestruck look upon Rachel's face that probably mirrored his own. He looked back at Sam, who seemed to be watching Jacob and Rachel's reactions to the actions taking place.
Is this what you called us for?
He asked, still shaking off the wonderment.
Well, that's not all of it.
Sam replied, and he reached for his leg's tactical pouch. He produced a small pipe, similar to a flute, but it was stranger than that. This instrument had a strange aura to it, as if it was empowered by something greater. This strange instrument pulled Rachel out of her silent observation and drew her attention to the instrument.
What is that thing?
She wondered out loud.
Better question is, where did you get it?
Jacob asked, eyebrows raising into a questioning stare. Sam started to grin, folds appearing on his face mask.
Well, I acquired it from one of the trees.
Sam stated, the wide grin behind the mask growing sheepish, as she pointed towards a lone tree in the distance, a single branch snapped off at the end.
I assume you asked the Dryads politely if you could borrow their foliage.
Rachel noted sarcastically.
Actually, those two were out planting because they tried to chase me down. The creatures were a little less happy about the damage to the tree, and it made them even more furious that I got away. So I guess they were trying to choke me out.
Sam again smiled, chuckling softly. Jacob frowned. It might complicate things now that the creatures had a reason to be furious with one member of the team.
What made it so worth it to make this flute out of one of the branches?
Sam did not respond, but rather pulled down his mask, put the flute to his lips, and began to blow. The notes that left the flute matched the Dryad's voice in both pitch and strength. What was even more mysterious was the effect on the two Dryads. They froze and stood straight up. Almost mechanically, they turned towards the sound of the music emitting from the flute, eyes glazed over, as if in a dream. Sam changed the tune, turning it into a somber funeral march. The creatures visibly began weeping, green tear streaks falling down their faces. Sam stopped playing and put the flute away, and the two Dryads snapped out of their hypnotic trance and looked around, confused as to how they came about being there. After a few minutes of bewildered stumbling, the creatures regained their composure and resumed their first task of planting the seedlings. Jacob was impressed. He knew Sam had past musical experience, but he never thought it would apply to the mission.
How did that music put them in this state?
He asked Sam, his disbelief betraying his voice.
I think it's less of the music and more about the materials the flute is made of,
Rachel answered, pointing at where the flute was located.
I think the wood resonates with some sort of power, creating a trance-like state in the creatures. This is definitely a breakthrough for the cause. It seems they believe anything that the tune sounds like, which explains the reaction to the funeral tune.
Certainly is a fantastic start.
Jacob said.
The problem here is, just how in the world are we going to get close enough for their leader to play a concert?